In the early morning hush, a brooding mist blanketed the French countryside, filling the air with a heavy, unsettled silence, a silence weighted by the spectre of war and by the myth that no fortress could ever fall. Inside bunker command posts and thick-walled citadels, German officers clung to their last shreds of hope as distant thunder rolled ever closer. That thunder was American artillery, and on this decisive day in 1944, it would deliver a sobering message. The age of the impregnable fortress was over, and every legend built upon that promise was doomed to crumble. Once fortress walls had seemed eternal. The Germans believed with almost religious devotion in their network of militarized bastions, the Siegfried Line's endless pillboxes, the reinforced garrisons of Brest and Metz, and sprawling fieldworks and tunnels woven into Europe's ancient bones web. Their faith was as strong as the concrete, as deep as the iron bolts anchoring each gun slit and observation deck. These symbols of defiance echoed the great citadels of history, yet were modernized for a new era of mechanized warfare. Commanders bragged about walls 2 meters thick, armored turrets and labyrinthine passages, certain that these would break every foe on the edge of their guns. But in the months leading up to this day, whispers of a new terror circulated among the Allied ranks, a weapon so immense, so thunderous it could split a mountain in half, the American 240mm howitzer. This beast, the largest field gun ever fielded by the U.S. Army, embodied the industrial might of the nation that lay beyond the Atlantic, its barrel stretching nearly 25 feet, its shells weighing over 350 pounds each. Webb 12. The men who operated it called it the bunker buster, and spoke of the recoil that shook the very earth below their boots. And the Germans, who first learned of its existence from captured orders and trembling scouts, responded with disbelief. "It's impossible," one colonel whispered to his adjutant on the eve of an American siege. "Nothing created by man could punch through our fortress walls." That sense of invincibility crackled through every radio transmission and field report. But dawn was coming. As the first pale light seeped over the horizon, and each American gun crew loaded their massive weapons, the fate of these fortresses would change forever. General Bradley's orders were clear. Brest must fall, and every American artilleryman would see to it personally. The howitzers thundered to life with an electrical fury, sending their steel projectiles arching skyward in a spectacle that defied imagination. When those shells landed, the world shook, not just from the blast, but from the psychological tremors unleashed within the German command. Inside the fortified citadel, Lieutenant Hans Vollmer clutched the granite windowsill and stared at the fields beyond the wire. He'd spent months fortifying his position, ordering extra layers of concrete, positioning anti-tank guns, trusting in the designs dictated from Berlin. Each morning, his men checked the mortar seals and tested communication lines, convinced that these rituals would keep death at bay. But as the first American shell screamed out of the sky and slammed into the fortress roof, that faith shattered. Stone exploded, sandbags vaporized, and the very layout of the structure seemed to ripple under the impact. The noise was beyond description, a violence that left men deaf and disoriented. Down in the corridors, dust billowed like poisonous smoke, filling passageways and choking the defenders. Doors crumpled inward. Ammunition stores were set aflame, and the reverberations split old bricks from new. The American guns kept firing, methodically targeting every weak spot the engineers could guess at. It was science and brute force, coldly married in the pursuit of destruction. In the field, American artillery crews operated with grim focus, running calculations and shouting coordinates with military precision. Each shell was a small victory, celebrated by the roar of the gun and the shouts of spotters confirming a direct hit. "There's nowhere they can hide," Sergeant O'Leary muttered, wiping grime from his cheek and watching the distant fortress buckle. Every hour another wall comes down. As the bombardment raged on, German commanders realized the horrifying truth. Nothing they had built, nothing they had put their faith in, not the strategies, nor the engineering, nor even the morale could withstand this assault. Reports filtered back to headquarters with mounting terror. Fortified bunkers were reduced to rubble, pillbox doors torn open like tin cans. The myth of impenetrability shattered in a matter of hours. Some defenders tried to flee, risking sniper fire and shells even as chaos spread. while others huddled in darkened basements, praying the next shell would miss. Yet for every fortress that fell, history demanded to know, why were these strongholds so vulnerable? The answer, as every American gunner knew, was threefold. First, no matter how thick the concrete, repeated pounding by heavy artillery would eventually break it down. Second, precision targeting by Allied observers pinpointed weaknesses, the corners, embrasures, ventilation shafts that earlier generations of defenders never had to worry about. Third, American supply lines, unmatched in scale, fed the guns with endless shells and fresh crews, ensuring that each day brought even greater destruction. Word of the devastation swept through German lines like wildfire. In bunkers near Metz, officers debated whether their own fortifications would be next. At headquarters in Paris, staff sounded alarms and searched for new solutions, but found none that could be deployed in time. Field commanders begged for reinforcements, but even fresh troops could not make new fortress walls appear. The reality was inescapable. The age of the concrete castle was dead, and the world's greatest empire would have to retreat from the defenses it had once called unbreakable. For those who survived the assault, their stories became cautionary tales. Hans Vollmer, whisked away by a medic after his citadel collapsed, would spend years recounting the scene. The darkness, the noise, the moment his men realized their faith could not save them. No one believed it, he later told an American interrogator. We constructed our walls with everything we had, steel, stone, hope. But when your guns came, it was as if nothing mattered. All we felt was fear. Across America, the victory was celebrated as proof that engineering and firepower could triumph over myth. Newspapers hailed the howitzer as the giant slayer, and military engineers studied every crater left behind, looking for new lessons to carry into future wars. But for the viewer watching footage of the aftermath, ruins smoking on a distant hill, dazed survivors shuffling from the wreckage, the emotional impact was undeniable. These were not just buildings destroyed, but dreams and fears that had shaped an entire generation. What did this day mean for history? It marked the end of an old way of thinking, a seismic shift from faith in walls to faith in firepower. It forced German commanders to rethink their strategies, turning away from static defenses and toward desperate mobile war. It taught Allied leaders the value of overwhelming force and marked a new era marked by speed, industrial might, and devastating precision. Above all, it forever changed how armies would face one another, in the open with nowhere to hide. As dusk fell over the ruins and the last American howitzers fell silent, victory seemed deeply bittersweet. For every fortress flattened, thousands paid the price. Yet one lesson remained, echoing in the silence after destruction. In the era of mechanized war, no legend of invincibility could survive the thunder of American guns. When the smoke cleared, the world was forced to confront a new reality, and nothing would ever be the same. The myth had ended. The truth had arrived, carried on the thunder that broke legends forever. Inside the walls of the mighty Brest fortress, silence gave way to chaos. The stone corridors, once echoing with military speeches and confident plans, now thrummed with the nervous energy of men who sensed the coming storm. Since sunrise, the distant roar of howitzers had crept closer, rattling dust from centuries-old bricks and igniting the imagination of every soldier hunkered within. Behind each steel blast door, German officers rehearsed defensive protocols with dutiful precision, but eyes betraying dread darted toward the ceilings, each one wondering if today would be their last. Brest was no ordinary stronghold. Its design was both ancient and modern. Medieval ramparts had been reinforced with thick layers of concrete, armored gun turrets, and an intricate labyrinth of passageways suited to repel invaders. In every alcove, camouflage netting and sandbags hinted at desperate improvisation. The Reich's architects had optimized every angle for defense. Anti-tank ditches rimmed with barbed wire, overlapping fields of fire, roof-mounted machine guns. These walls had stopped previous assaults and witnessed many false alarms. Yet nothing prepared its garrison for the monstrous artillery now zeroed in from miles away. Webb, the Webb-Aufreint, positioned atop a small rise, Lieutenant Vollmer's bunker stood at the crossroads of fate. Each time another American shell crashed into the perimeter, the entire structure seemed to quake. Overhead, concrete cracked and ceiling lights flickered, while debris slid across the floor, loud and relentless. Vollmer's radio sputtered with fragments of orders from higher command, urging hold at all costs. He barked instructions into the static, urging his men to seal bulkheads and check ammunition, all while a heavy dread built in his chest. The walls themselves felt alive, straining under a punishment for which no engineer could ever truly prepare. As the bombardment intensified, American spotters on the hills played a deadly game of adjustment, relaying fresh coordinates to gun crews and shifting focus toward known weak spots. One section of the fortress, an old gate repurposed as a machine gun nest, received 8 direct hits in as many minutes. Its defenders, seasoned veterans from the Eastern Front, were forced to abandon their posts, diving for the relative safety of an underground storeroom. But security underground was an illusion. Blast waves surged down staircases and through ventilation shafts, sending chunks of masonry careening toward huddled figures. Within the chaos, moments of grim heroism sparked. Corporal Dieter, the engineer responsible for repairs, braved collapsing passageways to haul sandbags and pour concrete into newly opened wounds in the wall. Each crack patched, bought only minutes before the next shockwave splintered more of the fortress. In one corridor, medics tended to the wounded by flashlight, their hands trembling as they bandaged shrapnel wounds and stemmed blood from the unlucky men who couldn't outrun the blasts. Outside, ammunition caches erupted in flames, sending thick clouds of choking smoke through narrow tunnels and out across the ramparts, blinding every defender. On the American side, artillery crews pressed their advantage with relentless discipline. The bunker buster shells, whose shrieking descent was audible even inside the fortress, transformed the battlefield into a landscape of craters and shattered walls. Spotters celebrated each successful strike, waving colored signal flags as confirmation rippled down the communication chain. "Keep firing! They're not surrendering yet," barked Sergeant Collins, voice hoarse from dust and adrenaline. The scale of devastation forced the German defenders to adapt. Several battalions abandoned exposed positions to regroup deeper within the fortress, hoping that layers of stone might buy them time. Others attempted last-ditch counterattacks, flinging grenades over collapsed parapets or racing through smoke-filled halls to repel American infantry probing the breaches' web. Yet with every passing hour, the fortress's formidable reputation burned away. Its mighty walls cracked, its spirit battered by the thunder outside. By mid-afternoon, confusion reigned. The command structure fragmented as radio relays failed and officers were cut off from their units. Vollmer's headquarters, once the nerve center for all Brest defenses, fell eerily quiet, the telephones dead and the maps useless under falling plaster. Messengers dashed from bunker to bunker, delivering updates written in shaky handwriting, only to vanish as another shell reshaped the corridors behind them, the realization that nothing would hold forever. The stone, the steel, or the men themselves swept through the fortress like a chill. Some defenders prayed, whispering ancient oaths lost beneath the roar of guns. Some wrote quick letters home, scrawling messages as the blasts echoed in their bones. Others simply stared at the trembling walls, counting seconds between impacts. Knowing that every moment of survival was borrowed time, through it all the fortress endured, refusing to collapse outright, even as its legend grew thinner by the hour. Its defenders would fight on, hoping for miracles. But the truth was undeniable. Brest was under siege, and the world was learning that not even the strongest walls could keep out America's guns. When night finally fell, and the guns paused, the ruins glowed red in the dim lantern light, haunted by smoke, shattered dreams, and a new chapter in the history of war. With the outer walls pounded nearly to dust, the siege of Brest entered a new and agonizing phase. The standoff, a bitter contest of endurance and desperation locked within a landscape of ruin. The Americans, numbering over 75,000 men, had managed to fight their way through layers of minefields and pillboxed enclosures, only to discover that the heart of the fortress was a tangled maze of stone and steel still bristling with resistance. Weber. Inside the shattered stronghold, General Ramke and his 40,000 defenders had dug in with grim resolve. Paratrooper divisions, renowned for their ruthless discipline, manned the barricades shoulder to shoulder with naval infantry. Veterans from sunken battleships given rifles and a final duty. Ammunition remained plentiful, artillery still boomed from hidden emplacements, and snipers haunted every vantage point. Dense clouds of dust and smoke rolled through the halls, marking each explosion's frantic aftermath. With the civilian population evacuated, each day was a blur of counterattacks, shell-shocked silence, and brief flashes of hope crushed by horrifying new barrages. Webb tasked the Americans, meanwhile, pressed their advantage with relentless artillery firepower and aerial bombardment. Bombers swept overhead, unleashing napalm rockets and 1,000-pound bombs on bunkers and the remaining city blocks. On the ground, engineers and infantry advanced house by house, dodging machine gun bursts and clearing concealed mines. Each advance cost dearly. Deadly crossfires, snipers, grenades tossed from blackened windows. The fortifications, built to withstand even the worst, now bore the scars of industrial-scale warfare, their stone faces collapsing under the combined onslaught. Webb says, inside the German headquarters, communication faltered. Radios spat static. Messengers vanished, crossing open alleys, and supplies, once ample, began to dwindle. Vollmer, the lieutenant who just days before had assumed his men could hold out indefinitely, confided to an exhausted corporal, "It won't be long before rations run out. The Americans have us surrounded, and their fire never ceases. We can only hold the line as long as the fortress holds, and even stone grows tired. Stalemate bred fatigue. The simplest act, fetching water, carrying ammunition, tending the wounded, became deadly. Medics labored non-stop, their uniforms red with blood as bomb blasts shattered all notions of safety. Above ground, survivors clung to what remained of their positions. Some fought on in bunkers with only sporadic electricity, memorizing the toll of the next bombardment by the tremble of walls and the collapse of another ceiling. Others braced for the inevitable storming by American assault teams, haunted by stories of flame-throwing tanks and the pitiless hurrah of advancing Rangers. Webb's Horesa, Webb's in tanks. By now, the city itself was unrecognizable. More than 90% destroyed, Brest turned from fortress to wasteland. Jagged silhouettes of once stately buildings loomed across landscapes littered with shell craters, barbed wire, and the blackened wreckage of vehicles. American and German dead lay together in open fields, reminding those still fighting that this day was not about glory, but survival. Amidst this devastation, pockets of fierce resistance sprang up. German units isolated by collapsed passages and burning streets assembled for desperate last stands. Paratroopers rearmed with scavenged grenades, sailors operating old French anti-aircraft guns, scattered infantry, forming barricades with whatever they could find. Each skirmish was brutal and brief, measured in seconds and meters, until another bomb forced the survivors underground once more. Webb. The Americans responded by redoubling their efforts. Engineers built mobile bridges, cleared mines, and coordinated with rolling barrages. Infantry probed for weak spots, while spotters called in artillery on any bunker that sprouted a machine gun flash. British Churchill Crocodile tanks joined the fray, their flamethrowers turning fortified houses and pillboxes into infernos. For defenders, the psychological terror of fire was compounded by exhaustion and hopelessness, the realization that every hour spent fighting was another hour borrowed from death. As the siege dragged into its third week, rumors spread among German defenders about possible relief from the Luftwaffe or a counterattack from distant reserves, but none came. Each day, further lines of defense were swallowed by fire and shock. Inside improvised command posts, Ramke grimly acknowledged that no army could win against endless fire. Letters home, smuggled out by wounded men or daring couriers, painted a picture of total collapse. The city razed, the fortress broken, hope draining away with the last supplies, yet surrender was not yet an option. German doctrine demanded last stands, and no officer wanted to be the first to raise the white flag. Even as ammunition dwindled and the wounded overwhelmed available care, fighting continued in cellars, tunnels, and barricaded rooms, soldiers determined to exact a price for every inch lost. For the Americans, each day of siege brought mounting casualties. Crossing open ground under fire cost hundreds of lives, and house-to-house fighting exacted a psychological toll as severe as any physical wound. Yet every advance brought them closer to the fortress's heart, and the symbolic victory that would reverberate across all of Europe. The confirmation that no fortress, however famous or well constructed, could stop the concentrated fury of America's guns. Webb. As September wore on and the final defenses crumbled, a sobering reality dawned over both sides. In this standoff, the true victors would be those who endured the longest, but at a price that stained every brick in memory for generations to come. Dawn crept reluctantly over a landscape drowned in smoke and echoes of destruction. The fortress of Brest, battered by weeks of unrelenting shelling and fire, was no longer recognizable as the proud stronghold that had once embodied German confidence. Towers that once bristled with guns now slumped as twisted ruins. Bastions, painstakingly reinforced over centuries, stood gutted by flame and explosives. This was not simply the end of a siege, it was the final, harrowing collapse of a legend. Webb T. Stat Webb T. Carbon Webb 30. The night before, American commanders devised their most decisive assault yet. High Command, recognizing the cost in men for every gained meter, ordered a concentrated wave of airstrikes and heavy artillery to precede the infantry. The pounding began at dawn, shaking foundations already cracked and churning the fortress interior into a chaos of dust and fear. Bombers swooped low, dropping napalm and demolishing what little shelter remained. The walls, once thought impenetrable, split open as though clawed by giants, exposing defenders to the advancing U.S. troops. Webb. Inside, German morale buckled. The defenders, led by General Ramke and paratroopers forged in earlier deadly battles, had been lauded for their discipline. Until now they'd repulsed attack after attack, countering every breakthrough, rallying in cellars and behind barricades. But hunger gnawed at every belly, water became scarce and ammunition dwindled. Medics pressed wads of torn shirt against wounds, improvising under the relentless pressure. Vollmer, pale and hollow-eyed, urged his men to hold on just a little longer, but his voice had lost its strength. Around him, engineers shored up collapsing walls with shattered furniture as any last hope of relief faded. American Rangers and infantry pressed forward, house by ruined house. Satchel charges and flamethrowers led the way. Troops blasted their own tunnels through adjoining walls to avoid the lethal crossfire haunting each street. At the formidable old city wall, still looming even in ruin, engineers brought up heavy guns and fired point blank. Amid the thunder and dirt, soldiers sprinted from crater to crater, trading rifle fire at arm's length with desperate defenders. In this grinding battle, the distinction between fortress and graveyard vanished entirely. By midday, key strongpoints had fallen. The British Churchill crocodiles, belching fire, forced the surrender of even the staunchest strongholds. Bunkers cooked from within, pillboxes silenced as their gunners scrambled from infernos. Unit after unit, German resistance crumbled. Communications broke down entirely. By afternoon, not a single functioning radio remained. The chain of command collapsed as men surrendered in groups, some waving makeshift white flags, others simply emerging stunned and empty-handed from blackened corridors. Then, suddenly quiet, jarring and total after so many days of chaos. When American forces reached the fortress center, they found scenes of heartbreak. Men wounded but alive huddled together in the gloom. Medics rushed in, their boots squishing through debris and blood, to drag survivors from crumbling rooms. In Wilson Square, the battered remnants of the German garrison awaited their fate. General Ramke himself, after symbolically firing his last artillery shell, now stood grim and silent among his exhausted men, ready to surrender. 24. That afternoon, the official capitulation unfolded with a strange and subdued dignity. German officers, some still in scorched uniforms, marched out from ruined doorways and laid their weapons at the feet of American commanders. Prisoners were counted, thousands at a time, each man registering disbelief that the ordeal was finally over. Among the ruins, American soldiers gazed in uncertainty, stunned by the magnitude of what their artillery and determination had accomplished, but the price was steep. Nearly 10,000 American casualties had been incurred to take Brest. German losses were even higher, with more than 30,000 captured or killed. The city itself was gone, buildings leveled, cathedral spires snapped like matchsticks, port facilities beyond repair. Only medieval stone ruins, blackened and pockmarked, hinted at the fortress's centuries-old might. Bidi Web before. In the smouldering aftermath, the true impact of America's artillery supremacy became clear. German survivors, once convinced that no fortress could be breached, waited in silence to be marched to prison camps. For them, the world had changed forever, in the roar of falling shells and the relentless charge of enemy infantry. Letters home, penned by those who could still hold a pencil, described not only the terror but the awe with which they now regarded their adversaries. American victors, too mulled over what had been won and lost. Brest's port, once coveted as a logistics hub, was so badly damaged it would never again serve its strategic purpose. Yet the psychological impact of victory rippled through every command. The myth of the untouchable European fortress had been utterly annihilated. From this day on, generals on both sides would recalibrate their plans. No wall was impenetrable. No garrison could hope for rescue if surrounded. The age belonged to those who wielded overwhelming force and unwavering resolve. Webmuina, Webkaister, Webfarm. And so the fortress fell, not just as a collection of stones and guns, but as an idea. When dusk lowered over the city, the last echoes of gunfire faded into brittle silence, marking the end of an era. For every soul who survived, and for the many who did not, Brest would forever symbolize the day when firepower rendered legends powerless, and the world moved irrevocably into a new and terrifying age of war. The siege had ended, but the devastation lingered over Brest like a relentless shadow. Allied shells and bombs had not only obliterated ancient ramparts and modern bunkers, they'd erased the soul of the city itself. More than 90% of Brest was leveled, streets reduced to jagged pathways of rubble, historic squares buried beneath smoking debris, and port facilities shattered beyond repair. Everywhere the cost of victory could be measured not just in casualties, but in shattered lives and lost memories. For survivors, the transition from battle to aftermath was surreal. The echoes of artillery faded, replaced by the groan of bulldozers and the murmurs of engineers and medics. American troops, victorious yet somber, walked among the ruins, helping extract civilians from collapsed apartments and treating enemy wounded with stoic compassion. The city's remaining population, almost all of whom had lived in hiding or endured severe deprivation, emerged, dazed from their shelters, to a world irreparably transformed. For many, the destruction of Brest was both trauma and liberation, their tormentors now prisoners, but their homes erased, their livelihoods swept away by tides of steel web. The German survivors faced a harsher reckoning. Stripped of weapons and defiance, they shuffled into makeshift POW camps established amid the ruins. Many officers, including General Ramke, faced interrogation not only for military failure, but for alleged war crimes, executions of French civilians, destruction of civilian property, and looting that had compounded the horrors of occupation. Months later, the West German government would begin reparations to the battered city, trying to ease memories of starvation and homelessness. The Americans too found their victory bittersweet. Brest's port, so coveted for the Allied supply effort, proved unusable. Not a single supply ship would dock there by the time of Paris's liberation, robbing the operation of strategic value even as it delivered a moral lesson. No fortress in Europe could withstand coordinated firepower, air power, and relentless ground assault. This realization would shape the Overlord campaign moving forward. Instead of storming every held port, Allied armies chose to encircle or bypass many, leveraging mobility and the threat of overwhelming force. The emotional toll reverberated for years. Letters from soldiers described not triumph, but exhaustion and empathy. American medics wrote home about tending enemy wounded. GIs described handing out rations to shell-shocked civilians, sometimes giving away their own chocolate to French orphans. Those images, the scorched streets, a city's heart torn out, haunted survivors and inspired stories of perseverance. Brest, for the Allies, became a symbol not just of martial dominance, but the tragic price of victory. In an era where legends were shattered and innocence was always collateral, damage Web 24, Brittany's civilians, for their part, greeted the Americans as liberators, After 4 years under the boot of occupation, marked by fear, famine, and repression, the arrival of Allied forces signaled hope, a world restored, freedom promised, justice soon to follow. For Jewish families who had survived in hiding or on the run, for resistance fighters who had risked everything. Each day in the aftermath brought a new kind of uncertainty, a fragile peace, shadowed by memories of the violence just ended Webbecue. In the ruins, the city's future was uncertain. Reconstruction would take years. Scars would remain forever visible. Parents walked children past trenches filled with rainwater instead of flowers. Churches and schools disappeared overnight, replaced by temporary shelters and soup kitchens. The ruins of the port became silent testaments to the technological might wielded by both sides, and to the folly of believing that concrete could stop the march of history. Webbecue, the fall of Brest changed the way both sides saw war. For Germany, it was a lesson in the limits of doctrine. Static defenses no longer guaranteed salvation. Fortresses, pillboxes, deep bunkers, all were vulnerable now, rendered obsolete not just by engineering but by resolve. The American armies moved on, carrying the lesson to Metz and beyond. For Allied planners, the siege taught them the profound cost of set-piece battles. Better to encircle, to starve, to move swiftly when possible, saving lives even as the end result remained inescapable. Webse. But the legacy of Brest was far more than tactics and logistics. It seeped into the memories of those who had fought, those who had survived, and those who simply endured. Elderly Frenchmen recalled nights sheltering under ruined arches. Mothers remembered searching for missing children among collapsed buildings, and Allied veterans revisited the bombed squares decades later, leaving behind medals or flowers at hastily built memorials. History would mark the city as both a victim and a turning point. Brest served as evidence that the industrial age of war punished defenders and bystanders alike, that every legend, no matter how strong its walls, could be undone by relentless innovation and tragic necessity. Yet amidst the ash and echoes, new stories grew of resilience, rebuilding, forgiveness, and the stubborn hope that even a city so grievously wounded could one day rise again. And as the sun set over the battered stone, Brest stood as a warning and a beacon, a place where myth met reality, and the reality, though cruel, promised future generations that endurance could follow even after the guns had fallen silent. The echoes of artillery may have faded, but the wounds in Brest's landscape and soul endured. World War II left the city not merely battered, it was almost entirely erased, its historic streets reduced to endless stretches of rubble and dust. Web 2. Surviving citizens and liberators alike gazed in dismay on a horizon of ruined homes and gutted landmarks. Yet out of those embers began one of the most daunting and ambitious reconstruction efforts in modern European history. Rebuilding Brest demanded more than bricks and mortar. It was a challenge of spirit, to resurrect community, dignity, and hope, where war had stolen everything. As early as 1943, even before the fortress fell, French officials appointed architects to prepare a vision for the city's rebirth. Jean-Baptiste Maton, the first chief architect for reconstruction, faced the daunting task of balancing tradition and innovation. A city with deep medieval roots needed to be made both modern and habitable. The port, the lifeblood of Brest for centuries, was a critical priority. Engineers and laborers worked around the clock to clear sunken ships and twisted steel from the harbor. The French Navy quickly restored basic facilities, aiming to re-establish Brest as a key base for national defense and international shipping. Web 3 and 6. Web 3. Still, the scars of war meant that for years large swaths of the waterfront were off-limits, an open reminder of what had been lost. Housing presented an even greater challenge. With entire neighborhoods obliterated, thousands found themselves homeless, sheltering in temporary structures or the few cellars left standing. Web. Post-war Breton authorities, supported by a wave of national initiatives, commissioned massive apartment blocks and public buildings in austere styles. Granite and concrete dominated the new cityscape, guided by utilitarian necessity, but also reflecting the era's optimism for renewal. The architectural contrast was striking. Medieval towers like Tour Tanguy stood beside functionalist bridges and apartment complexes, a living tapestry of old and new Web4. Re-establishing community was no less urgent. Schools, churches, and market halls had to be rebuilt from the ground up. Cultural leaders and city officials rallied to preserve fragments of Brest's vanished past, reconstructing significant buildings when possible and commissioning memorials to honor the dead and the liberated. By the 1960s, the city's identity was transformed, proud of its resilience, defined by a mix of investigation and invention, forever aware of the scars that shaped its streets. Your economic recovery followed the infrastructure. The reopening of shipyards and the gradual renovation of the port invited new jobs. Brest re-emerged as a center for maritime research, naval training and shipping, drawing on its strategic location and hard-won experience. Fanta. The city's universities and science institutes helped make it a hub for oceanography and technology by the late 20th century. Social healing, though, proved more complex. For years, the city's population grappled with memories of occupation and destruction. Survivors of the siege and the resistance worked to create communities founded on compassion and collective remembrance. Museums and cultural events told not just stories of triumph, but hard truths about war, loss, and survival. The dynamic between past and present, a city that cherished both old legends and new beginnings, defined Brest's character. In recent decades, the city has continued this journey. Projects such as Les Ateliers des Capucins transformed bomb-blasted industrial ruins into vibrant public spaces, blending historical reverence with futurist ambition. Today, urban cable cars connect neighborhoods, media libraries throng with visitors, and the reborn port hosts both Navy vessels and happy families strolling along the waterfront. Brest welcomes international students, tourists, and businesses, its modern layout standing as a monument to perseverance and imagination. Yet for every innovation, the memory of devastation remains. Residents point out ancient walls scoured by fire, public squares layered atop hidden ruins, and the occasional medieval arch now embraced by banks of sleek apartment towers. The city's festivals pay homage to freedom while honoring those lost, refusing to let tragedy fade into mere historical footnote. Thus, Brest's post-war rebirth is more than a tale of rebuilding. It is a testament to civilization's ability to rise from utter ruin. With each new stone laid and each tradition preserved, Brest's people have proven that the flame of endurance burns brighter than even the fiercest guns. From the ashes, a city found not just new walls but new dreams. The city of Brest, resurrected in stone and memory, stands today as both witness and warning. Its story, stretching from medieval ramparts to post-war boulevards, charts the perilous journey of a legend through the crucible of annihilation. But amidst these stark transitions, war, reconstruction, and renewal, one question echoes louder than any artillery barrage. What changed forever when America's guns proved that no fortress was truly invincible? For centuries, European generals had staked their strategies on stone. Walls were not merely defense, they were declarations of resolve. The great fortresses of Brest, Metz, and others dotted the map like ironclad hearts, each promising safety, endurance, and the certainty of outlasting any siege. Militaries poured wealth and ingenuity into thicker masonry, deeper moats, more intricate fields of fire. The legends grew with each new conflict. Fortresses battered but never breached became symbols. For defenders, they were hope incarnate. For besiegers, the ultimate test of patience and power. Then came an era of change. In the dark, smoky months of 1944, Brest's final siege became the setting for a seismic revelation. American guns, chief among them the thunderous 240mm howitzers, were not limited by myth or morale. They introduced a new logic to the battlefield. What could be built by human hands could also be shattered by engineering, coordination, and industrial might. It was not the lack of will, skill, or courage on the part of the defenders, but the remorseless advancement of technology and doctrine. From the moment the siege began, old rules failed. Precise artillery spotting, the relentless rotation of fresh American crews, and the systemic targeting of structural weak points meant the fortress was doomed not by its builders' errors, but by the changing game itself. No matter how brave the last-ditch counterattacks, how ingeniously German engineers patched collapsing passageways, or how many desperate appeals for reinforcements rang out over broken radios, the outcome was inevitable. This unraveling of the legend had ripple effects well beyond the walls of Brest. European strategists, stunned by the fortress's rapid downfall, reconsidered generations of defensive planning. The myth of the impregnable citadel, so essential to national storytelling, to morale, to the very concept of territory, had died under the hammering of American firepower. Concrete, once thought eternal, was proven finite. Commanders across Germany realized that even the famed Siegfried Line, with its endless pillboxes and bunkers, could not hold back the tide when faced by coordinated artillery and air assault web. For the Americans and their allies, the lesson was equally stark. Victory did not come cheaply. Taking Brest and similar fortresses claimed thousands of lives, blunted the advance, and destroyed infrastructure so thoroughly that often the strategic benefit, such as the coveted port, was lost alongside the legend itself, In the aftermath, Allied planners shifted their tactics. The bypassing or encirclement of strongpoints became preferred to frontal assaults. The cost of shattering myth was measured in both blood and missed opportunities. Beyond battlefield strategy, Brest's siege held grim lessons for the civilian world. It revealed the fragility of urban life beneath the weight of war. People who'd believed stone and tradition would shield them found that the tools of destruction had far outpaced the rhythms of normal existence. Entire neighborhoods vanished in minutes. Churches, schools, shops, pillars of communal identity, were buried with shocking speed. All that remained after the guns fell silent were questions. What kind of world demands this degree of devastation? And what kind of people emerge afterward? The answer for Brest slowly became clear. Its citizens, left amid the wreckage, showed sadness, courage, and extraordinary adaptability. The challenges of reconstruction demanded communal action, sharing resources, caring for the wounded, clearing ruins with bare hands, and drafting blueprints for tomorrow. The architects Jean-Baptiste Maton and the city planners did not simply rebuild, they reimagined. Brest's rebirth was unapologetically modern, blending the surviving medieval outposts with functionalist apartment blocks and public squares dedicated to peace web. In every stone-laid lesson ingrained, the generation that came of age in post-war Brest, living in the shadow of ploughed earth and ghostly memories, carried forward lessons their ancestors never imagined. War had taught them endurance, but also the necessity of adapting, forgiving and preserving cultural soul despite massive loss. Festivals revived, schools filled, and innovation took root in places once marked only by pain. The city's harbour regained its place in Europe, not as a fortress, but as a hub of innovation and cooperation. Yet the agony of Legend's End was not forgotten. Brest survivors and those who inherited its stories marked anniversaries with sober reflection. Memorials rose from the ruins, stone crosses and statues, inscribed with names and dates commemorating not just the fallen, but the myth itself and the lessons it birthed. Tourists and historians alike now walk among old and new, reading plaques and tracing their fingers over pockmarked walls, imagining the thunder that once resounded and the determination that followed. In the broader context of history, Brest's siege reshaped thinking far beyond Brittany. NATO and Warsaw Pact strategists looking at Cold War maps recognized that armies must evolve or risk defeat at the hands of new technologies and doctrines. Political leaders debated how best to secure their nations, sometimes choosing dialogue over concrete and flexibility over static defense. The unspoken message was clear. No legend could ever guarantee victory against reality. Brest's struggle and survival became a case study in the transformation of warfare, humanity, and identity. The loss of Legend did not spell doom. Instead, it catalyzed an era of questioning, rebuilding, and creative endeavor. Brest endured as more than a city. It served as the crucible in which new values were forged, a living reminder that community, resilience, and innovation can flourish even amid the ruins of grand illusions. Visitors today, wandering Brest's reborn streets, feel both the weight of history and the spark of hope. Children play where soldiers once fought. Families share meals in cafes that rest atop centuries-old foundations. Stories of loss and renewal weave through daily life, imparting perspective. The city does not hide its wounds but wears them as badges, reminders of both vulnerability and the will to rebuild. The teachers, artists, and leaders of modern Brest ensure that legends are not merely mourned, but interrogated, their lessons carried forward. In museums and libraries, interviews and diaries testify to the price paid for victory and the new courage required to shape reconstruction. Monuments dot the skyline, bridges link old neighborhoods to new developments, and every festival is both commemoration and celebration. Thus, the legend unraveled, but the learning endures. Brest's fate is a clarion call, to never hold faith blindly in stone or myth, to seek renewal after devastation, and to remember that even the strongest walls can be broken. Greater still, the city's story teaches that resilience and unity are the true fortifications, a lesson paid in pain but passed forward in hope, a lesson for every nation and every generation who wonders what remains after the thunder fades. And there, in the twilight of a rebuilt city that once knew the pure sound of steel-breaking legends, Brest offers its final lesson. We can rise again not because the walls will save us, but because the spirit within them refuses to yield. Modern Brest rises as a testament to resilience and ongoing transformation, its silhouette shaped by both the echoes of devastating war and the determination to reinvent itself. No visitor can quite escape the powerful contrasts. Massive granite and concrete buildings, clean post-war lines and scattered survivors of the city's medieval heart stand side by side, each announcing an era defined by necessity and hope. Web, nos web, dis web, est web, ist. From the ashes, Brest learned to look forward, embodying renewal not only in architecture but in spirit. In the aftermath of World War II, with over 90% of its historic center obliterated, Brest's leaders faced immense challenges. The city was almost an empty shell, the old neighborhoods of Siam, Recouvrance, and the bustling port now flattened or burning. The reconstruction was rapid, guided by principles of modern hygiene, functionality, and mass housing. Web, CU. City planners worked feverishly to provide shelter, jobs, and dignified public spaces for a population traumatized by loss and displacement. The result was strikingly modern. French authorities, supported by international aid and reparations from Germany, commissioned functionalist urban designs that prioritized efficient traffic flow, ease of movement, and abundant light. Brest's rebuilt city center became unrecognizable, even to long-time residents, with the famous Rue de Siam, once the beating heart of the old city, now defined by uniform apartment buildings and wide boulevards rather than winding medieval lanes. Only the Château de Brest and the Tanguy Tower, perched on their ancient stone foundations above the Penfeld River, remained as stubborn reminders of the city's warrior past. Yet as concrete replaced ancient walls, the city did not forget. Memorials rose amid new development. The rebuilt American Naval Monument on Cour d'Ajot Boulevard stood as a symbol of Allied sacrifice and Franco-American friendship. Hidden sections of ancient walls and battered churches survived the Blitz and now offer poignant stops for visitors, silent witnesses to the brutality of war and the endurance that followed. Brest's economy, once lashed tightly to its strategic naval importance, adapted as the decades unfolded. Beyond serving as one of the two major French naval bases, Brest diversified after the war into metallurgy, shipbuilding, electronics, chemicals, and paper production. By the 1970s and onwards, the creation of new industrial zones reflected the city's ambition to offset the declining importance of traditional naval construction and to find its place in a rapidly globalizing Europe. But just as important as economic recovery was the renewal of community and culture. Brest today is densely populated, young and vibrant. More than 41% of its inhabitants are under 30, and the city hosts over 30,000 university students. The region's strong Breton identity pulses through its festivals, music, and local culinary traditions. with new generations reclaiming what was nearly lost during the years of occupation and battle. Cultural centers, libraries, museums, and waterfront events reveal how history can be embraced, not escaped. The city's relationship with the sea remains central. Brest's deepwater harbor is a marvel of engineering and history, hosting naval vessels, research ships, and international regattas. Visitors marvel at the ongoing transformation of once-ruined port districts into hubs for maritime research and oceanographic innovation. At Les Ateliers des Capucins, a former naval workshop now transformed into a vibrant social and cultural space, locals and visitors mingle, sharing stories, art, and ambitions for the future. Webusono Webhielde, urban cable cars now link neighborhoods previously separated by terrain and history, blurring boundaries and symbolizing a new era of connection. Yet Brest's scars are not hidden. The stark utilitarian blocks peppering its skyline speak to trauma and endurance, not mere design choice. Residents often describe their city as having a modern soul with an ancient heart, and the loss of the winding alleys, the historic markets, and the ornate city halls is still felt. For many, the unique blend of new and old is not simply a feature. It is a living testament to the reality that war disrupts, but cannot wholly erase. Brest's emphasis on education, embodied in its universities and technical institutes, underlines a core local belief. True renewal is built upon learning, adaptation, and critical reflection. The city has, for 20 years, focused on integrated educational policy, cultivating curiosity and open-mindedness in its youth, while honoring the legacy of the past. Modern Brest is as much a learning city as a maritime center, prepared to meet global challenges from climate change to new technologies. For tourists, Brest offers not just the thrill of the Atlantic winds and the marvel of engineering, but also a living case study of how a community survives and thrives after catastrophe. The Castle of Brest and Tanguy Tower invite contemplation of centuries gone by, while the bustling new commercial port, the lively Rue de Siam, and the open festivals celebrate what is possible when a city refuses to surrender to oblivion. Cuisine, music, art, and the warmth of its people serve as reminders that renewal is not just physical. It is emotional, intellectual, and social. In every facet, Brest continues to evolve. As the second-largest military port in France, hosting nuclear submarines and scientific fleets, it anchors France's security and innovation. As a learning city, it cultivates imagination and resilience. As a destination, it welcomes travelers not with romantic visions of untouched antiquity, but with the compelling narrative of survival, loss, and fierce creativity. Web 56. Ultimately, Brest's journey from fortress to ruin to dynamic modern city encapsulates the story of Europe itself. It is the living proof that all legends, even of invincibility, will eventually be weathered by time and the onrush of change. Yet from those ruins, new stories, new energy, and new future will always emerge. Brest stands as a beacon of how communities can honor the past, confront painful truths, and build new beginnings with courage, vision, and collective purpose. The lessons learned in its siege, the agony of its destruction, and the triumph of its renewal remind every visitor and every generation that hope is forged not in myth or fortress walls, but in the hearts and hands of people determined to rise. If you've stood with us through the thunder of history, you know there's always more beneath the surface. Hit subscribe now and ring the bell, because every story of war, courage, and consequence deserves to be told. Join our ranks, dive deep into the untold battles, and become part of the mission to remember. Your next chapter starts here.